Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Dominic Mills podcast. Back with another interview with a great guest. Dr. Mikolaj Raszek is a founder and owner of Merogenomics Inc, a consulting company based out of Edmonton, helping clients with private access to whole genome sequencing and related technologies. Merogenomics Incorporated specializes in cancer DNA profiling, DNA testing for undiagnosed diseases, and prenatal screening and sequencing in healthy asymptomatic individuals for preventative assessment. Dr. Raszek did an undergrad degree in genetics, doctorate degree in biochemistry, and postdoctorate work in agriculture genomics. Mikolaj is passionate to educate about genome sequencing and how we can look into our DNA code to gain important medical insights. We discuss his life, DNA sequencing, and much more. But first, let's blast that intro.
Samuel cuts it back. Ohio State wins. Barry looks, fires, touchdown Buckeye. Oh my goodness! Barry Rozier, how do you do? Cousins, Ohio State, look out, ball! You don't like that. You don't like NBA basketball.
Okay, we are welcoming Dr. Mikolaj Raszek to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, before we get too into the topic, I've actually heard you are quite the artist, and you've actually gotten to meet Michael Jackson a few times. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, you found that out. That's hilarious. You must have heard
Mhm.
that from another podcast. Yeah, I actually, believe it or not, I met Michael Jackson 3 times. I was a huge fan when I was a kid. So I did anything I could to make that dream come true. And
Mhm.
yeah, I was always a good painter. And that's what I did. I painted giant paintings involving him. And if you're a Michael Jackson fan, you know how it works. There would be like a scenery of him with a bunch of kids in a Disneyland, and
Mhm.
he was a sucker for that stuff. All Michael Jackson fans would have known that. And
Mhm.
I unfolded these giant paintings in front of his hotel room, and his security would be like, "Who's this? Who's this from? All right, let's go and meet Michael Jackson." Yes. Yeah, it was real fun. I met his kids as well. Very kind individual. Of course, he knew that he has to be kind to his fans because that's what made him famous
Mhm.
is the affection and love of his music by his fans. And to this day, I enjoy MJ's music for sure. It's not the same impact when you're a kid and teenager, but yeah, the influence is permanently there. And the reason why is because Michael Jackson's music influenced my interest and studies in humanitarian rights. And there was
Mm.
part of my life that I really focused on that. But then I discovered a lot of negativity, and I was like, nope, I have to abandon this. There's too much evil going on in the world as well that is
Mhm.
just too stressful to learn about.
Yeah, does get depressing when you get into it, and you can see just how different things are in different areas of the world and how it's handled. But whenever I
And
see some,
I'm much more interested in like the positive component
Mhm.
of the world. Like, of course, let's not be naive. We know that bad things happen all the time in the world, but it's much more interesting to me to focus on the positive trends and how overall the world and the humanity is becoming better and better. I know that sometimes it doesn't feel like that, but overall, that I actually truly believe in that trend.
Yeah, I would agree. Um, so, whenever I see someone with multiple degrees and doctorate work in fields of medicine and science, I like to ask which degree you achieved is the most rewarding to you personally.
Hmm. What a question. Never even heard that question. Actually, interestingly enough, my passion is genetics, but that's not the degree I will pick. It will be my doctorate degree, and my doctorate degree was biochemistry. The reason why is because it's the marriage between the genetics and biochemistry that finalized my ability to read scientific literature so effectively and understand it very well, which is my forte at the moment. Everything I produce in my work has to do with published scientific literature, whether that's the videos I make for my YouTube channel, the articles I post on my blog. And clearly, my entire business model was built on my ability to learn how medical DNA testing should be provided to individuals. So it was through that second degree that allowed me to really enhance my ability to delve
Mm-hmm.
into scientific literature. Genetics is, of course, the study of what's happening with your DNA, but that DNA then has to be used in the real world. That's the microbiology, molecular biology, I should say, and being able to understand that world, which my second degree gave me that ability, was really, really impactful. And hence the videos that I also make.
Mm-hmm.
I can easily discuss these topics, which I don't think I would have that ability without that degree. So that would be my answer. And then, of course, it's the same. It's also the degree that gave me the title of a doctor. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
very
I
handy.
can. Yeah, I can understand that. I wouldn't have even thought of that being what has helped you the most in terms of being able to read studies and be able to decipher what they mean and like get those broad pictures from that. So when did you first become interested in the medical field?
In which field?
The medical field, or genetics and
Okay, so
biochemistry.
medical field, so much in molecular biology sciences is tied to medical field anyway. So there a lot of research in laboratories is focused on how can we improve the medical field. Basically, how can our work be tied to human health? That happens a lot. So it's interrelated. Automatically you are exposed to that. This is why someone like myself, being in molecular biology sciences, I'm automatically heavily brainwashed towards how should I lead my life to have the most positive impact, health impact, for example. So, when you expose your entire life for literature or to literature that teaches you that how destructive to your well-being smoking can be, I won't be smoking, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so on. And same with, say, diet and exercise and so on. And so they just simply are interrelated. So interest in medicine was always there, just because I had to be exposed to it by sheer nature of looking into molecular biology anyway. But when it comes to medical DNA testing, that actually happened also during my PhD, because my PhD was related to immunology, and I was studying, searching for novel immunosuppressive compounds. So, potential drugs that could suppress your immune system. Of course, you'd be asking yourself, why the heck would you ever want to suppress your immune system? But there are situations where you absolutely required. One simple example is whenever a person has to have an organ transplant, you need to suppress your immune system, because otherwise your immune system will completely reject the organ, right? And you won't be able to live. And we do have very, very effective immunosuppressive compounds, but they're toxic to some degree, and eventually they they will kill that person as well. But the person buys up to 3 decades of extra life potentially, right? So, but there's still need for novel immunosuppressive compounds. And in my work, I was going about it in a very unusual way. I was taking the enzyme that is important in the activation of the immune system and mutating it to understand how compounds could be interacting with the mutated form of that enzyme, to learn then how the compounds could be chemically modified to actually inhibit properly the original version, which we call wild type
Mm.
version, the natural version. So as a consequence, I had to deal with mutagenesis of genetic material. And just by coincidence at the time, that's where the new technology came out. It's called next generation sequencing, that now allows massive amount of very rapid sequencing of lots of material, which then finally allowed for the first time the possibility of rapidly decoding human genome. And I was hooked from the start. I loved it. That was
Wow.
approximately 15 years ago. Of course, at the time, if you wanted to decode your genome, it would have cost you probably several $1 million just when that technology came out. Right now, you can get the same, actually, not the same, you can get way, way better outcome for a few $1,000s. So the technology has moved forward. And the moment I saw this, I understood this will be hugely impactful for medicine. And that's turned out to be the case. DNA testing or decoding our genomes, i.e., our entire DNA, has honestly revolutionized medicine, probably almost every facet of medicine. A lot of people
Wow.
might not know this, right? But that has happened. And so I'm glad I already had background in genetics. I already had prior interest in genetics. So I decided to be like, this is going to be my world, my field. And
Yeah.
eventually you have to narrow down your passion, your interest, and make a career, right? So then I decided this would be it.
Wow, that sounds like it ended up working out perfectly for you. Like all the stars aligned for you to find that perfect track. So,
Almost.
yeah. How would you say what you do is different from other places that uh, study genetics like 23andMe and Ancestry.com?
Okay, so ancestry, first of all, is not medically related. So that one is more how are you related to the individuals that whose data has been collected all over the world, and therefore that's how your ancestry is to some degree a certain very different concept. Now 23andMe does ancestry, but it does actually do a small component of medical genetic testing as well. The biggest potential issue that people should be aware about 23andMe. So the test quality is perfect. Well, I shouldn't say perfect. It's really, really high quality. But what happens with 23andMe, that test looks for only specifically selected mutations. So if say this is from between my hands is the span of a gene, 23andMe will look at this spot, maybe this spot. That's it, right? But you can
Wow.
have a mutation anywhere in that length of a span of a gene. So what that means is a test like 23andMe is basically very limited in the amount of information that it captures. And whoever takes this test, they need to be aware of that, because if you get a negative result, meaning, hey, we didn't detect a mutation that we might have worried about, that does not mean you're out of the woods for the rest of the gene. You still could have a problem literally in a site adjacent to the mutation they're looking, and they wouldn't be able to detect that because they're not even looking for it. So people who take 23andMe test need to be aware of it, and approximately 99% of information is completely missed. So
Wow.
that's one important criteria. Versus with properly done medical DNA testing, you analyze the entire gene. Not only do you analyze it for the sequence, but then at times you also have to look for it at the arrangement of the sequence. So what does that mean? You could decode the sequence without realizing that part of the gene is actually inverted, just because of how the testing takes place. Normally, you take the gene and then splice into many, 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 many fragments. You get the point, right? You
Mhm.
decode those fragments and then computationally you put it back together. Computationally, when you put the fragments together, you might not realize that a whole chunk of that gene might have been actually switched, inverted. So there's another technology might be required to figure that out. And with proper medical DNA testing, that's the type of in-depth analysis that takes place. So that would be the primary difference. And everything that I'm interested in and everything that I try to provide access, private access to people, that's the medical DNA testing and only medical DNA testing.
Wow. So that's like a completely different class of what you guys are studying versus what they're studying. They can't even, you said 99% more. Like that is complete. Well, I mean, you're doing a lot more than they are. Like it's
Yeah,
whatever
yes,
the percentage comes out to.
and
Yeah.
that's reflected in the price, right? This is
Yeah.
23andMe is a very cheap test for what you get, right? It's
Hmm.
very, very cheap test. And with 23andMe, they probe mutations across your entire genome. So you as a consumer, you get a sliver of the information that they actually probe for, because they don't make money off of you at all. A lot of
Mhm.
people don't understand this, but 23andMe is actually a pharmaceutical company. So they use that information to learn how they could be developing ideal drugs. And 23andMe does a
Wow.
lot of other incredible work. So as far as I know, the last time I checked, so remember this field is always in a flux. But as far as I last time I checked, 23andMe was the only mm, company that was offering a test that actually allowed to look for your type 2 diabetes genetic predisposition based
Mm,
on looking at hundreds of different mutations. Extremely powerful data, extremely powerful information. And the reason why something like that can be offered is because in order to validate it, you literally need thousands upon thousands of patients to be tested. And 23andMe has tested not thousands, but millions of people by now. So that gives them a lot of power to do fantastic research and offer, and probably continue to offer in the future, really, really unique products. And hopefully that's exactly what we're going to see. But that does not mean 23andMe is a substitute for bona fide, genuine medical DNA tests. Not at all.
right. Yeah, it feels like 23andMe is looking for your stuff so they know what kind of drugs to make when you're older and you need the drugs. And it's like you're trying to look for every sort of mutation that could cause a problem in the future, sets them at a predisposition for a problem in the future, correct?
Yeah, you got that. Perfect summary. Really well said.
Okay. So who would you say clinical DNA testing is for then? Like just everybody in general? What is the ideal situation for how it would be used?
I divide everyone, so that would include you, into
Hmm.
four categories. All right. So maybe let's start with where it would be most beneficial, and that would be for people who already exhibit some form of disease symptoms, right? And they need to figure out more, either A, what disease it is. So that would be people who are afflicted with undiagnosed condition, meaning they have a condition or a disease that our current standard methods of medical testing cannot give them that answer. That happens actually more frequently than people realize. And anyone who's in that category, they'll be like nodding their head right now, be like, yeah, I know what he's talking about. So that's one aspect. And approximately 50% of the time, when such individuals employ full genome sequencing or exome sequencing, which is analysis of all of your genes in your genome, they get an answer to as to what might have been broken in their genetics that led to that condition. So that's one example. The other big one is people who have cancer. So again, you already have a disease symptoms, and the reason why is because think of cancer like your genome that has now been mutated to become a separate individual. So it's like different organism that has evolved from your own genome to be unique. And depending what mutations cause cancer to develop in the first place, you and understanding that, you could potentially have the privilege of aligning specific medications to treat cancer. So when I mentioned earlier, I think at the start of our discussion, that medical DNA testing has revolutionized medicine, cancer is probably the most affected field we know of. It's not the same at all thanks to DNA testing. And there's now well over 100 therapies called targeted therapies that are already approved for cancer treatment, which is based on the genetic profile of cancer. So
Wow.
traditionally, in the past, we used to align treatments of cancer based on origin of cancer. So which organ did it come from? Now there is a shift towards not the origin per se, but the genetic origins
Wow.
of cancer. So that would be another example. So those are people that already have symptoms, right? There's also asymptomatic individuals, So that's two more categories of individuals. Number one is pregnant women, so they can use this technology to assess the child to see whether there's any anomalies in the developing fetus. Or the last category is anyone, that's you and I, people who look presumed healthy, quotation marks, because we all have mutations, so we all have probably something. Most of the time, whatever that something is benign. But if we were to screen many of such presumed healthy individuals, approximately, give or take, maybe 5% of the time, you would discover pathogenic mutations that are indicative A of either risk of developing a disease, cancer is most common such discovered risk, or actual diagnosis that there, hey, you actually have a genetic condition that right now might not have yet produced any symptoms, but very likely might produce symptoms in the future.
So with that group specifically, if you're able to find something that shows that there may be, I don't know, if a predisposition to a specific cancer or something like that, like shows like you're more than likely to develop this, is there a future in developing, oh my goodness, sorry, my dog is going crazy,
No worries.
would there be a future in maybe having therapies that could help prevent the growth of the cancer, I guess is the way to ask that.
Absolutely. Great question. I love it. And the reason why is because, as it happens, the most common problems that are discovered in presumed healthy individuals are also the medical problems for which we do have interventions available. So you can see the value, potential value of decoding your genome to discover, hey, what is lurking in there, because there are interventions available to you. Now, I understand DNA testing might not be for everyone if you are afraid of discovering that information, right? Because even because intervention is a very broad term. One of the interventions is actually surveillance. Surveillance means, hey, if I have a genetic predisposition, for example, for cancer development, then I can now screen myself more frequently. And why would I do this? Is so that I can actually catch that cancer the moment it shows up in my body, because the sooner we can catch cancer developing, the greater the likelihood of successfully eradicating it. So that's very well understood. That's, I think everyone knows that anyway, that
Hmm.
stage 4 cancer, when you discover that, that's always more challenging to successfully treat in comparison to stage 1, right? But nevertheless, for some people, surveillance would be stressful. Hey, this constant worry, will this cancer ever develop or not? But and on top of that, you also could be discovering information for conditions that are untreatable. Especially some of them are late onset untreatable conditions. Parkinson's is a good example. Alzheimer's is another one. And then that is one of the ones that we fear the most is Huntington's, right? Because we know that eventually we will lose our cognitive abilities with some of these conditions, and that's very scary. And
Hmm.
so, but as a client or patient, if you undertake such a test, you don't have to obtain information for untreatable conditions. So, of course, I did my genome, right?
Hmm.
And of course, I had it analyzed, and I chose to look for everything. I was like, give me everything. But I can tell you, I was scared going to a doctor for sure. 100% I was scared going to a doctor to find out, hey, what is my report going to say? I, and Huntington's came to mind because I know what that condition is. And I was like, imagine if I were to discover this right now, today, it's life changing forever, right? So I was nervous, but I was like, well, I want to know. I want to know, so I go for it. But as a consequence, because of that fear I experienced, I completely understand that this might not be for everyone. Because otherwise, I wouldn't dwell on fear every day. But there are individuals that are predisposed to greater level of anxiety than, say, maybe like myself, so they might worry much more frequently than myself. So not going to be for everyone.
Yeah, and that's a crazy thing to think about because when you just say the sentence at face value, like it's an expensive test, but if you could afford to get that test and know everything that you're predisposed to, when you ask a healthy person that, or a person that feels like, well, even a healthy person, you ask them, would you want to do this? You get to know everything. That's a question that may be difficult for a lot of people, and you wouldn't think it would be when you just first say it, but then you're like, I mean, some people may want to just be like, and they may live a happier life.
It is a challenging question, and surprisingly to me, I would say the answer sways more frequently towards I rather not know than know. But that's also because of the potential worry. But
Hmm.
I always reflect back, well, what if I gave you information where you can discover, hey, there is a possibility of a problem, but we can do something about it right now, as opposed to you not discovering that and then you are faced with a problem. And at that point, it might be too late. Would that be then of value? Just look at that particular information. Some of that is literally information given to you like on a golden platter. So, one of the more common problems discovered, one if it ever is discovered, right, like I mentioned, majority of people, if they were to sequence their genome, if they're presumed healthy individuals, they will not discover anything. But when you do discover something, one of the top three issues discovered is genetic predisposition to Lynch syndrome or colorectal cancer. And that's a very deadly condition. And unfortunately, in Canada, it's usually identified at later stages. The reason why is because it's so asymptomatic. By the time you show clinical symptoms outwardly, that already means your organs have been pretty badly affected inside. All this development of cancer before that, no one is the wiser, right? And that's why oftentimes it's discovered late. But discovering it early, because say you knew you had a genetic predisposition to that, then it dramatically influences chance of survival for such individuals, like really dramatically. So it's this is a very I think accurate example to demonstrate how powerful this information can be.
Yeah, I agree. When you said revolutionizing medicine, I think that's the perfect way to articulate that. I understand it's going to be an expensive process now, but what is the process in terms of it becoming more available to everybody? Is it just more time, more experience with the technology, making it easier, more accessible?
Yeah, more time definitely. Few factors still have to be met. So it still has to become more cheaper than it is
Hmm.
to become more accessible. I think that's universally acknowledged. But another one is more doctors have to be familiar with this technology and willing and comfortable to provide it to patients, including publicly, which is exactly what Merogenomics is all about. We help clinics get set up with access to medical DNA testing that clinics can then privately provide in Canada to their patients. And the reason why that needs to happen is because right now we do have obviously medical DNA testing available in Canada, but they're provided in specific centers and they will be limited in their scope in comparison to what is currently available. The technology is continuously moving forward and it's always obviously ahead than what will be publicly available in
Hmm.
healthcare. And so I believe that the revolution will truly begin when everyday doctors can then provide this to everyday patients. So that still has to take place, and there's nothing that can be done except time, because either the currently existing doctors, the vast majority of which had never had any training in this, they either have to be willing to now educate themselves usually on their own away from their work with patients in this area, or they have to be replaced by new wave of young doctors who now are learning about this in their medical curricula.
Yeah, so that sounds like that process may may take a little while.
It will, it will. There's nothing that can be done. That's just normally how technology is incorporated, and something that exists now usually will take many years before it becomes common standard.
Okay. So you spoke a little bit about your company and its mission. How long? What was the process of creating it, and what's the process of building it been like?
Well, for me, it was insanely unusual because I literally took a few years off and stopped working. And I did, in those few years, I did nothing but just study literature for several years. I studied the application of medical DNA testing from every single angle that I could imagine. And once I understood the process and how the process takes place based on proposed guidelines in different regions of the world, then you start going deeper, and it took a very long time. And partially the reason why it took so long is because I had to go overcome my own fears of chasing medical doctors and talking to them, meaning basically I had to feel super confident
Hmm.
in the information I have, and it took a long time, but that's what needed to happen. And then, even then, I didn't do it in a typical fashion, which is you look for investors and so on, because I'm a scientist. I didn't know anything about business, so I also simply built everything on my own, literally. So and it also took a while to obtain contracts, because it's like a chicken and egg situation. You go to the companies, medical companies that can offer genetic testing, to sign a contract with them. But I don't have, for example, contracts with a clinic. We don't deliver tests directly ourselves. We sell it through clinics. So we also need to have contracts with clinics so we can see
Mm,
this
yeah.
chicken and egg situation. But we finally overcame that hurdle. That took a while of and quite a bit of pestering of these companies to get these contracts. And now we have few contracts. And in fact, we're also building a very new service where we're going to be offering full genome sequencing service. And in order to provide that service to patients, we will bring in three up to four different companies just to offer this one test, um, to patients. So you can see how involving it can be. But it will, by doing that, allows us to be able to focus on what is the latest and the best, which might otherwise not be available to to private individuals. So that is basically the goal here. So you can see it's quite involving. So we weren't able to actually start officially selling anything till approximately 2020, when we actually finally signed our first contract with the very first clinic to that was willing to work with any clients we bring to them, because our client automatically becomes some doctor's patient. Because with medical DNA testing, doctor always is involved. You have to have an overseeing doctor. If you ever have an opportunity to get access to medical DNA testing and a doctor involvement is not required, I always say consider that as a red flag, to study that company further, to make sure that they truly offer or satisfy the criteria needed, so that the test results can actually then be properly used by a doctor in the future.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that the test itself is not valid, but I always say it's a red flag. Start investigating in greater depth to make sure that this is a proper service you are obtaining, or that you are wishing you are obtaining. Because there's many different DNA tests available out there. Many of them promise a lot of things, and they're just simply not actually for medical use at all. And the reason why this happens is because in scientific literature, we have publications, what we refer to as observations, but that does not mean they're actually accurate or real. The reason why we want to publish about them, that information, so that we can stimulate further research to confirm if it's real or not. That's why in science, Whenever someone tells you, hey, science is this, blah, 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 that does not mean it's accurate or true. When it becomes true is when it's repeated many times over. Then you
Right.
know it's valid, right?
Hmm.
And many DNA testing companies will take any information published that might link some observation between genetic mutation and an outcome, whether it's been validated or not. And therefore, you can have access to many different tests that are just, not that good quality. So, a warning, but there are certain things you would want to be looking for if you're truly looking for a proper medical DNA test. Number one is make sure that the laboratory is certified for work with human samples. Ideally, you would want to be using having a doctor oversight involved. And the last one, and this is truly the differentiating factor, is how is the genetic sequence interpreted? Because getting genetic sequence is not that hard anymore. This technology has been around for a while. It's pretty much standard. There's not many differentiating technologies available. So vast majority of the time, if you get your genome sequence, you're going to get it, provided that you get proper coverage, meaning it has to be read multiple times to make sure that what is discovered is statistically accurate. So it's true, then it's standard across the board. Where the true challenge begins is the interpretation of your genetic sequence, and many criteria has to be properly satisfied to make sure that interpretation is done well. So what kind of programs, computational programs, are being used, what kind of databases of patient information are being used is another example. So there's multitude of different criteria. So if you're into this, go for it, research it, but research it well.
How does somebody go about doing the process of researching for those things specifically?
I think internet and a lot of hard work,
Hmm.
and be persistent in that hard work, because if you're going to be researching this information on your own, then there might be a lot of new terminology you might not be familiar with, but if you persist, it will become familiar. Mm, and then you look for those telltale signs that I was just mentioning.
Hmm.
And there are numerous companies out there that offer super awesome high quality medical DNA testing. Absolutely. So yeah, and probably, mm, at least in every Western country of the world, because the Western world was had a head start with the use of this technology. So North America is one of the top leaders. Europe and China are are also the big leaders in utility of this technology.
Okay. So back when you were talking about the different types of DNA testing and how it could be used, that made me think kind of. My brain took a second of a science fiction detour, so it made me thinking
Right.
like we've all heard the stories of, or there's everybody's seen a movie where scientists manipulated the genome or DNA sequence and they started creating new human beings. Is that even possible?
Yes, it is, and it has already happened. So you're talking about the designer baby concept, and yes, the CRISPR technology, which is a bacterial system that bacteria have evolved in order as a form of immune defense, so that if viruses are infecting them, they can destroy it. That system has been now utilized and quite perfected to be able to manipulate any of our genetic material that we want. So we could now mutate our genetic material anywhere we want. So if you were to take fertilized egg, for example, you can now start manipulating human genome. That has indeed happened, and such genetically manipulated genomes, of fertilized eggs have been injected subsequently into a woman, and she gave birth to genetically modified babies, i.e., designer babies. So that happened in
Wow.
2018 in China and received worldwide condemnation. The condemnation was so large, and the world was just shocked to a point that that individual, that scientist, was actually, I believe, arrested and put in prison in China because it turned out that, or at least the stories being provided to us, that this person was a rogue scientist, did not actually have permission to do these type of experiments. Whether that's true, who knows? Because the gene that was being mutated happened to help reduce the likelihood of being infected by HIV virus, but at the same time, that gene might be involved in human intelligence development. So, what were the real reasons? Who
Hmm.
knows? Who knows? But it has
Yeah.
happened. Now, can are we going to do this one day? Yeah, I think we will cross that threshold. Not because I think we should. I actually think we shouldn't be doing this type of manipulation. The reason why is because human genome is so complicated that we don't really grasp it properly. So if
Hmm.
we start manipulating it, there's always unintended consequences. But I think despite that, we will do it because humanity has clearly demonstrated over the years its ability to break any ethical barriers and do any immoral act you can possibly think of. So hence, we did discuss human rights
Wow.
or its abuses, right? So I think it
Hmm.
will happen, and will happen most likely under the guise of improving medicine, but who knows why it will happen. And that means one day I would not be surprised if we actually drive our own evolution, synthetic evolution, so that
Hmm.
we could even become different species. So yeah, the technology is there, but we don't have the grasp. So whether you can go in and start designing your baby, no, not really, because the genome is so complex and the interplay of every gene product. So gene is just a information from, you need to use that information to actually produce something, uh, protein. Then that protein oftentimes has multitude of different functions. Frequently we don't even know what all of these are. So we are not ready at all for this type of manipulation, but I do think it will happen. Personally, I would say hope not, until we number of time or amount of time passes on where we have such profound grasp of our molecular biology. Just pretend we know already everything. Let's pretend
Hmm.
that. Then maybe we'll be ready to manipulate our genomes, because we could be removing certain aspects of our genetic programming that could benefit us, such as aging. For example, aging is, after all, programmed into our DNA, into our genome, and we could modulate it, we could manipulate it so that we don't age as fast.
Man, that sounds scary. The.
Yeah, yeah, the possibilities can indeed be scary.
Mhm.
But that's not as scary as, I think, possibility of being able to manipulate pathogens for biowarfare. And this
Mm.
is much scarier concept, because look, we're going through pandemic right now, and look how deadly a pandemic could be. And this is not
Yeah.
even that deadly of a virus.
Yeah.
Viruses can be far more deadlier than that.
Yeah. So. Wow. That that's got my. I want to ask something about the pathogens now. I hadn't even thought of that. Um.
That's
I feel like it.
my YouTube channel talks a lot about the current pandemic. Well, science.
Mhm.
It's all about science related to current pandemic, and especially with the focus on the mRNA vaccines, because I'm very interested in that technology, because I'm hoping that one day, once we perfected it, we're nowhere near its perfect use, because it's too new of a technology. Obviously, when you have a new technology, there's some requisite time for us to discover what we didn't perfect and how we can perfect it, and that will happen. And once we perfect it, my dream or fantasy, if you will, is that we'll be able to use this technology to maybe treat some of the genetic diseases that are currently afflicting our population.
Okay. Um, yeah, you talked a little bit about the mRNA. Oh my goodness, mRNA vaccines. How is that related, and how is that just related in general? How does it work?
Because with genetics, genes or DNA is just a storage of information. So think of your DNA as nothing more than just a filing cabinet. That's it. It's just information. From there, you need to open that filing cabinet, pull out a piece of paper, let's call that a gene, which has information. You need to photocopy it, i.e., you need to duplicate that. When you duplicate it, that's when you produce mRNA or messenger RNA. That messenger RNA is then taken out of the nucleus into the inside of the cell, but outside the nucleus, and it's the messenger RNA that is finally the blueprint to produce the final product of interest, which will be to produce a protein. Now, think of proteins are like tiny little molecular robots that do everything inside your cells. They're not the only robots. There are other things that make your cell seem alive, but proteins are the big component that do all bulk of the work inside your cell. So you go from DNA to mRNA to protein, right? So then with mRNA vaccines, you are injecting a blueprint inside the cell to tell your cell, build this protein. Now, the cell is not any wiser where that mRNA came from. It might as well think, oh, it's my own information that must have come from nucleus. It's already here. I'm going to use this blueprint to produce the product of interest, in this case, spike protein. And then the spike protein, once it's produced and expressed on the surface, or its fragments are shown on the surface, are those fragments or the spike protein are used to stimulate the immune system, because once it's presented by the cell, our immune system is like, whoa, this is not ours, right? This doesn't
Hmm.
belong here. And you activate the immune system. So but you can see this this technology, which is basically manipulation of genetic expression. In this case, we are manipulating genetic expression of something that does not exist in our body, the spike protein that comes from
Hmm.
the virus. But we can also use the same technology to introduce mRNA that is present inside our body, but for example, might be broken. And because the mRNA or the DNA is broken, either one could happen, if either the DNA is broken, meaning it's mutated, so you cannot produce the desired final proper molecular robot, or the mRNA is broken, meaning it's mutated so that the final desired molecular robot is not produced, then imagine using the same technology that we're currently using to vaccinate ourselves with mRNA vaccines. We're now using to introduce the correct mRNA to substitute for the broken ones we have in our body. And boom, you're fixed. Your problem is fixed. Now,
Wow.
this sounds very simple, and it's not wouldn't be applicable to every single condition. It would be applicable only for conditions that can be overcome with proper mRNA being able to overcome the production of the broken product in conjunction with the properly functioning product. So that needs to be satisfied, and of course the mRNA has to be targeted to the correct organ where you want it to be. So it's what I'm saying. It might sound simple or trivial. It's
But
not.
it's definitely a tricky process. Yeah.
But one hopes that we will solve these big riddles, and eventually we'll be able to one day possibly use this technology to treat our own human diseases,
Hmm.
not just to introduce something to stimulate our immune system against a pathogen, but something that can actually treat our diseases. So I hope that that answers that question.
That does, and it gives me a happier hope about it, because I it's been hard to take this designer baby out of my mind. I'm not gonna lie to you. The was did the woman actually give birth to the baby?
Yeah, yeah, two babies were born, at least two that we know of, because this process was done in more than one woman.
I say
Now,
it
I
sounds like you
believe,
think there's more.
There might be more, except that we know nothing about either the children, what's happening with them. We know nothing
Mm-hmm.
about their identity. We know nothing about any other women who might have been impregnated with the same genetically manipulated fertilized eggs. Nothing. So yeah, I believe there might have been a report once that said yes, additional babies were born, because when this happened, multiple women were impregnated at the same time with this technologically, I guess, manipulated gene constructs, and only the first woman that gave the first two babies made the world news,
Mm-hmm.
and which was broken by the way, believe it or not, via YouTube. Very unorthodox, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then on YouTube first, and I think a couple days later it was spoken on at a conference, and the world was just shocked. But then we know absolutely nothing about that, about the well-being of these children. It's all kept under wraps.
Do you think that the only reason it's still under wraps is because of where it happened? Or do you think if it happened in any other country, that they would be kind of
Well,
keeping it?
partially from ethical point of view, indeed, the identity of those children should never be revealed,
Right.
precisely so they can have a normal life.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, imagine if their identity was known, that family and those children probably just would be bombarded with with questions and requests for interviews. I do hope they are very carefully studied, just so that we can understand. Hey, was any harm accidentally introduced
Mm-hmm.
by an attempt to manipulate their genomes like that?
Yeah.
Because CRISPR is not perfect either yet. We're still perfecting it. But when you use this technology to introduce a mutation of interest in a very specific location, sometimes that same technology can go elsewhere. Now, apparently, they confirmed that that did not happen, but whether that was 100% certain, I can't remember anymore. But yeah, it was a simple process. A part, I believe, what happened is a tiny fragment of a specific gene was removed. So, and this type of deletion, that's what it's called, when it occurs naturally, because they were duplicating or attempting to duplicate what occurs naturally already, or what has been observed in other people in our human genomes. Such individuals, when they have this small fragment of a specific gene missing for certain reasons, they just at their risk of being infected by HIV is reduced.
Yeah. Wow.
So, but yeah, it shouldn't have happened. It, I actually thought I was never going to witness that in my lifetime. In
Mm-hmm.
my lifetime, and this already happened 4 years ago. Just because I didn't think anyone would breach that ethical barrier, not that soon.
Right.
That's because we just don't understand enough, and and also it's not medically necessary. This is not the only way we have to reduce the likelihood of being infected by HIV, right? So
Yeah.
you can see why there was such a worldwide condemnation. Yeah, the world was shocked,
Yeah.
absolutely shocked. I do have a couple articles on the designer babies on my blog, so if you're really into
Yeah.
that, then
Yeah.
I
I'll look
recommend go
into.
check it out.
Yeah, I'll check it out, and then I'll to anyone who's listening that's really interested in that. I'm definitely going to be including those in the show notes because I want to read more on that. I had no idea that that had even happened. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people don't, because genetics a lot of the genetic stuff flies under the radar,
Mm-hmm.
despite the fact that it is one of the biggest mm, data that is now being produced worldwide. So it might have already surpassed, in terms of the amount of data we produce from genome sequencing, might have even surpassed YouTube by now. So it
Wow.
gives you a sense of how massive this world is. It's really, really big. But the reason why is because human genome is so large. Well,
Mm-hmm.
obviously it has to be
Yeah.
giant, because it's, think of it as a program code. It's a program code that not only runs you right now, it's also the program code that made you from a single cell to who you are right now. So all of the details of, hey, how do you go from this tiny little cell to who you are today, that has to be in that program code. Imagine you try to produce that program code from scratch right now. Not gonna
No,
happen, right?
yeah, it would take you way too long. I think I
we,
was
we, we have no ability to do that,
yeah.
but over the eons and thousands and thousands of years, Mother Nature, through randomness, has managed to produce this elaborate and amazing code
Yeah, I think
with
I think
maybe some higher intervention if you choose to believe that, right? It's and you can make
mm,
that into either extraterrestrial or spiritual, right? It doesn't have to be all random. Just recently I saw a report. I didn't see whether there was a scientific publication, but I saw a report that they were able to find all of the organic compounds needed to start creating life on meteorite, or basically
mm, I think I did read that as well.
space debris type of thing, right? So
Hmm.
that's one example, but to me, science never ever ever has to run a conflict with spirituality
Right.
at all. But which is totally fine. But I always say, if you believe that there was a higher being, for sake of simplicity, let's call it God, that had an influence there, then I always say, well, God could have just sprinkled things. Evolution could have taken over everything else, because
Yeah.
evolution happens all the time. Perfect example is the virus right now that is running through the world. It is evolving very rapidly, and it's evolving due to immune pressure that it's experiencing, right? So the same thing happens all the time with all organisms. There is a outside world that is putting pressure on the genetic material to be selected in to be one specific thing over other, in order to respond to that environment that is continuously ongoing. So the greater the genetic diversity of any species, the better, because
Hmm.
you increase the likelihood of survival if some cataclysm happens. So imagine, like, the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs. um, well, they just didn't have that genetic diversity to survive that kind of enormous cataclysm. But other animals that were existing at the time did, and that's what gave rise to mammals overtaking the world, right?
Hmm.
So that gives you, like, as an example. So could we humans, for example, survive such cataclysm? Right? Would we have that genetic diversity where some of us would be biologically more predisposed to survive supreme harsh environment, right? So that's evolution in the making.
Hmm. And you speaking about that, I've been really interested in studying like the age of humanity recently, the past few months, like how many thousands of years we've been around, and it makes me think like we talk about how long it takes like nature's randomness to develop that long genome, and it makes me think how many times I don't know. My favorite thing to think of is I think that human beings are quite a bit older than what traditionally think that they are, or just that the human sequence has been around for longer. So I don't know. Maybe I could be way wrong. I don't have any real evidence that says we definitely were, but
Well, it
it's interesting
depends
thing to
whether
think
you're
about.
talking about humanoid organisms or our own species, right?
Hmm.
Because our own species is relatively young, but we didn't just show up out of nowhere. We have our own ancestors,
Right.
and that is a very long history. That's mm, that spends more than multiple millions of years, right? So it's a very, very ancient history
Hmm.
of evolution right there, right? And on top of that, we had multiple humanoid species,
Right.
including in the lifetime of the existence of our own species. There weren't just humans around. For example, Neanderthals, right?
Hmm.
totally different species, similar looking. There were other ones as well. We just happened to be the ones that survived, or we wiped them out,
Yeah.
whatever happened, which is mm, possible. For example, one thing that is not really appreciated is that pathogens is a biological weapon that organisms can use when they invade novel territory to basically take over that territory. And the pathogens that they might bring with them that they are now immune to, when they conquer that new territory, the organisms living in that environment might have no immunity against that, and these pathogens act as a weapon to start reducing the population so that the invading organism can take over.
Oh,
So we humans did the same thing. So we ran through a number of different plagues where through the movement of humanity throughout history, some of them with devastating consequences, obviously. But right now it's less and less likely, right? Because we pretty much, we've
hmm
already discovered the whole world, right?
Yeah.
And we've already mingled and we've visited every single corner of the world. We shared all of our diseases. Right now, the risk that we're facing is that novel pathogens might come out. By come out, mean they can jump from species to humans. So mutations can happen where a virus or a bacteria could somehow be adapted to now be able to effectively infect human, and completely new virus or new bacteria could emerge that could be very, very deadly. That could always happen in the future. As a matter of fact, we were overdue historically for a pandemic, and we all
hmm
knew that. That's one of the reasons why there was such a mass preparation and anticipation for pandemic in recent years, especially because the first SARS-CoV-1 virus, when it emerged, it didn't cause a global pandemic, but it was a close call. It was understood that this is a danger, and there was a reason why there was so much focus on understanding more and understanding also how to be better prepared for the next time it happens, which is now what we're actually living through.
Yeah. It's really interesting. You're saying like we've discovered most or the planet, and that we're not really going to be seeing a lot of, or we could be seeing new stuff. I read the other day that I think like a lot of the ice things, ice caps and stuff that have been frozen for thousands and millions of years could be thawing and releasing stuff that we have
Yes,
no experience with. I think that is something that is
good point.
incredibly interesting.
I didn't think of that. You're completely good point. Yeah, that could still happen. Yeah,
hmm
yeah, absolutely. Including including maybe a pathogen that is no longer around, but it was around
hmm
back then, way back then. We might we might dig up some, I don't know, mummified corpse, but if there is preserved pathogen in there that could come back, yeah, right. I didn't think of that. Maybe.
hmm Okay. Just wrapping up a little bit, I got two last questions for you. So, do you have any books that you're reading these days?
No, never.
Okay, I say
The
I'd
reason
understand that
why
you're
is
you're
because
incredibly busy.
I read science papers, and
Mm.
those are my books,
Okay.
by the way. And not that I haven't these books. I love reading books as a kid. I read a lot of books, and it's just I don't have time for books. But science papers, when I read, to me, each science paper is like a new chapter in a book, and you just never know what's gonna happen because it's continuously evolving story, with never ending. Sorry,
Mm.
I do have
It's
to
okay.
go and open the door for someone. My apologies. 1 second.
It's okay. All right. Ooh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, that's actually why I love science and scientific literature, is because it's constantly twisting narrative. You just never know what's going to happen. Every science paper you read is like, oh, there's new concept, new additional information, and if you start piecing all that information together, it's a continuously evolving story, and it's a lot of fun. I try to mimic that with the narrative of my videos on my Merogenomics YouTube channel. So then it's a additive effect of the information that I keep building up. But you never know what what the next video will be, because it's basically random papers that keep showing up. But they are actually building a story, and that's why like I don't focus on books, um, just on science papers. But like I said, I'm that kind of a nerd that actually can really enjoy reading science
Yeah.
papers. It takes
Okay.
special breed of people to love reading science papers.
Mhm. Um, I don't read official like science papers, but I follow science news, and I have the app, and every day I check to see any news stories. Did you see the like the ancient forest they found in that like 600-foot cave in China?
No, that's so
It's
cool.
like
How old
it's like a
was it?
I think they said millions of years. I don't remember the exact date, but it's over 600-foot cavern they went through, and there are trees in there that were over 130 feet tall.
That's insane. And they are this old, because that's I've on my blog I wrote about an article about aging, and I talked about what are the currently known oldest organisms on the planet, and it is indeed it was a forest as well. So I wonder if that was a forest in the U.S. So I wonder if it was dethroned by the one you're talking about. Very interesting, very cool
See,
information.
let me see if I can find how old it is. Um, but while I look for that last question, okay,
Sure. Hmm.
what is
Perfect.
what is one conspiracy theory you believe to be true? It could be anything from two people shot JFK to whatever.
Hmm. Oh, here is a good one. Um, I do believe that 9/11, it was not the planes that brought the buildings down.
Mm.
Scientifically, that makes no sense to me that the planes could achieve that, so they had to be demolished. Not to mention
Oh,
that there was a third building that came down that was never even hit by a plane. So I think, I don't know why we simply cannot admit to that possibility, but that is one that I do believe. Whether people will be upset at me for that, that's just simply, again, I don't really care, right? It's just
mhm.
what I believe. I don't talk about it with people, but yeah, from my limited scientific information on that, that was like, no, I don't believe that could happen, because never has happened since or before either, where a fire could bring a building down.
Yeah, that's a one of the most famous recent conspiracy theories. I don't know enough information about that specifically to be able to say for sure,
It's
but
true.
it's
It took me a while
I've seen
because
some say I've seen some pretty convincing arguments on it though.
it's normally. I mean, I enjoy conspiracy theories because, but which one I know for sure and I believe, that's very rare. I enjoy reading
Hmm.
about it because, to me, mm, there is element of truth presented in almost everything. Now, sometimes people can be presenting very silly information, but it's not the content sometimes that you need to focus on. It's it's what I believe is that a person might have a lack of ability to properly express what they're trying to express. What they're expressing is still what they believe is their truth, and
Hmm.
oftentimes there's always a grain of all truths that we want to promote. It's just that some people will express that very poorly, and it will come out as very silly, but to me they are still expressing element of truth. So as a consequence, I believe that we should always listen to everyone, and we should always listen to everyone with open mind, irrespective of how crazy it might seem to you. So I'll give you one example where I experienced that contradiction. So because of my channel, there's a lot of people that comment on the videos, "Hey, viruses don't exist." That clearly contradicts with my own knowledge, right? that does not mean that I should completely dismiss these people. The more appropriate investigation would be, why do you believe that? Because just because they're even mentioning it, it means that they are truly attempting to express some elemental truth about this world. They just
Hmm.
happen to potentially use a wrong vehicle, right? So that's why I think we should always listen to everything with open mind, always.
Okay, that's a fair point. I like that. Um, so I'm not seeing a date on anything in here. Just that the sinkhole contains a load of ancient trees and planets that could well include some species that have never been discovered before.
Nice.
I can email you this article, or I'll send it to you after this, just so you can see it. Yeah, I don't know. I'm really interested because it was just discovered on the 6th, so I'm sure they don't have enough information on it to be able to say for sure. But that's going to be something really interesting to see what other news comes out of that.
Right. Good catch. I like that too. That was really neat.
Yeah. All right, so that's all for me. Dr. Raszek, thank you so much for coming on. Do you have anything else you want to plug or anything?
Yeah, well, definitely my website,
Hmm.
merogenomics.ca, where you can learn about DNA testing. If you go to the procedure tab, anyone who wants to undergo DNA testing, I highly recommend go there because it's a very good educational background that will prepare you for any DNA testing. You don't have to do it through merogenomics because I can only work in Canadian jurisdiction anyway. And then the social media channels, we don't focus just strictly on genetics, and all of them are merogenomics handle, and I have a very popular YouTube channel as well. And the last thing that I would plug in is me and a couple colleagues got together and we built a holistic proactive well-being program for businesses to offer to their employees, where all three of us talk about our own spheres of expertise. So we have a financial expert that talks about financial well-being, we have a psychologist who talks about mental health well-being, and I teach about physiological well-being with the twist of how you can use DNA mapping to help you with that. And we have a program basically for employees to be able to learn about that and potentially use such tools to attain the highest level of comfort and well-being and joy as possible, so that we can all be as productive as we can, because we actually typically we love to pride ourselves on our productivity, right? and
Yes,
and
sir.
and positively influencing the world, right?
Hmm.
So we have a program on that if you're interested in that. For We have introductory seminars for business owners, and you can register for those at moneymindDNA.ca.
Okay, I
All
will
right.
make sure to link all of those in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It was a blast. I really
Yeah,
enjoyed chatting with you.
me too. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Dominic Mills podcast. If you like this episode, please make sure to leave a like, 5-star review, or rating on wherever you listen to this, whether it's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever. All right, that's all for me. So thank you for listening. Stay safe and stay curious.